morning to everybody out there, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whatever it is where you are. There's nothing like being reminded of how old you are when you hear how long you've been in ELT. So what I'm going to be talking about today for the next sort of 40-45 minutes is really to do with how we think as teachers about planning lessons and what kind of questions we can be asking ourselves when we're planning that will maybe lead to greater success in the classroom. And I'll reveal later that there may be enigmatic title, Back to the Future. I don't know about you, but for me, when I first started teaching, planning was a bit of a nightmare. I started teaching back in 1993, and my first real teaching job after I did my 1-month CELTA course, I'm always slightly ashamed to admit that I came into teaching on the back of a 1-month CELTA course, but that's what I did. And after my 1-month CELTA course, I then got a job in a private language school in London called St. Giles. And to begin with, I was teaching 30 hours a week, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And to be honest, I was then going home and spending probably at least as many hours again on planning what I was going to be doing in the classroom. I was quite anxious about my lack of competence. I was worried that my students would realise I wasn't what I felt a real teacher should be like. And often I'd literally kind of script out what I was going to say at each stage. I'd have to read the grammar notes at the back of the book to try to feel on top of the grammar in case students asked me difficult questions about things. And it was a very, very time-consuming, very stressful part of my job early on. I guess what I then did was to spend the next 2, maybe 3 years trying to work out how to make the course book work for me. At this point in my teaching career, I was using the books that were basically given to me by my school. So I was using things like the Cambridge CEC English course, I was using Headway. And over time, as I repeated my use of these particular books, I started to feel more comfortable with the pages. I knew how each spread worked or how each unit worked. And I bought my own copies of the books and I annotated them quite keenly. So I wrote in the answers, I wrote in all kinds of little extra comments. I started to include post-it notes, like kind of bright yellow and pink post-it notes containing information about supplementary material that I could use. And so eventually, after 2 or 3 years of teaching, I got to the stage where I could pick up my upper intermediate course book, as they were back then. I could note, okay, I need to photocopy this particular grammar revision activity here. There's a vocabulary activity in the school resource bank. I can photocopy and add a supplementary material here. I've got the answers. I know what I'm doing. I'm ready to go. And I think, you know, as a course book writer and as a teacher and as someone who's been in charge of teachers over the years, I recognise very clearly that all of the hours of planning and hours of trying to make a particular book work for you that teachers invest breeds a kind of reluctance to change. Back at that point, even though many of us used to sit and moan about various things we didn't like about the books we were using, we probably still wouldn't have voted to change the books we were using because we were used to them. And we felt comfortable with them, and there was a kind of security to using those books. I think, as I'm going to move on to suggest in a little while, part of the problem that I had, and that I think maybe a lot of teachers have, is a sort of lack of clarity about what my priorities should have been when I was planning. The problem of maybe prioritizing what I've come to feel are the wrong things to be focusing on when we're planning. Part of the problem I realized for myself was that given planning is something that all teachers everywhere do, Okay, no matter what stage of your teaching career you're at, you'll spend at least part of your day getting ready to plan your next lesson, your next week's lessons, your next month's lessons if you've got a lot of free time on your hands. Given this, I think, I realise now, looking back, that what I got on my 1-month CELTA course was inadequate to equip me to deal with thinking about planning. I think there's a kind of irony about planning, which is it's something so common that all of us do, and yet it's not something we often talk about. You don't hear many talks at conferences about planning. You don't see many webinars about planning. It's almost like something that teachers secretly do in silence or suffer in silence over. And as I said, on my CELTA course, we did very little on planning. When I was putting this webinar together, I went back and looked at my CELTA notes because maybe, as you can see behind me, I'm a bit anal and I keep all of my old books and notebooks and everything. And on my original CELTA course, we basically did 1 hour looking at planning. And I have the notes, and what the notes told me is balance. You need to mix the 4 skills. You need to shift the focus around when you're thinking about your planning. There needs to be interaction. You need to have links and themes that run through the lesson. You need a clear concept of your aims. Elicit information. I guess this was to do with making sure there's space within the lesson to get ideas or language from students and to work with that. Model the language first, then repeat it. I'm guessing this was about grammar presentations and the idea that a lot of planning was designed to model and get students to repeat examples of particular grammar structures. I was then told to bring students to the meaning of language items. It's over here, come this way, look. Ensure controlled and personalized practice. So again, it's thinking about lesson planning in terms of the traditional present, practice, produce grammar model of lesson planning. Anticipate student problems. They might make mistakes making past perfect questions or whatever. Plan your stages and your timing. I'm sure, like many of you, I went through that phase of thinking I could predict exactly how long things would take, and I'd write speaking 7 minutes, not 6, not 8, it's definitely going to take 7 minutes. And my favorite piece of advice from CELTA, use props, like an actor has. I don't know, you're going to do a reading about boxing, bring a boxing glove in. You're talking about British culture, have a large cup of tea with you. Use props. When I then started teaching and I was working at St Giles, I was assigned a mentor, an older teacher who'd already kind of been round the block a couple of times and knew what they were doing. And I'm still friends actually with the guy who was given to me to mentor me, to take me under his wing, a guy called Andy Fairhurst, who's also still teaching. And he basically saw that I was struggling. He saw that I was giving myself sleepless nights with all of my planning. And he showed me how the experts do it. Basically, we sat down with a piece of paper that looked a bit like this. We divided the paper up into mornings and afternoons for the 5 days of the week. He asked me, so what are you doing this morning? It was a Monday morning. And I probably said, I'm doing a listening and some grammar. And he went, right, fine. So this afternoon, do a reading and do some vocabulary and some speaking. Then tomorrow morning, you can do another listening, maybe some grammar again, bit of speaking. Afternoon, reading, do some grammar revision. And basically, you just mix it up like this. Friday, do some revision, leave a big question mark there because probably something will come up that you need to worry about during the week. Friday afternoon, a game and then a song, maybe watch an episode of 40 Towers on the school video, and then you're finished for the week. Basically, mix it up and keep things varied. And at that point, I thought this was a kind of divine revelation, that this was the solution to all of my problems as a young, stressed, overworked teacher. And so the path was made, really, for me. I think when I initially thought about lesson planning, I was very reluctant just to use the book as it was. I felt like I needed to chop and change things because I had this fear of being seen as being boring. I was trained, I guess, to believe that working through a course book was somehow, I don't know, opposite to or antithetical to what I was told student-centered teaching involved. I wasn't sure actually what student-centered teaching really meant, but I knew it couldn't mean just working through a course book. My feeling now is that what this kind of idea does to us as teachers and as a profession is it reduces and it limits the discussion of what teachers actually do when they use course books, because no two teachers ever will teach a double page in exactly the same way. Different things will happen in the class, you respond in different ways, different questions will be asked, teachers go off on different sidetracks. But often, because we're not talking about this, we're talking about chopping and changing and supplementing and adapting and rejecting. So perhaps we don't have as detailed a conversation about what we're actually doing and maybe why some things are better to do than others when we are actually using material. I also learned this idea of one of the more unfortunately named acronyms in English language teaching, ARSE, which comes from Jim Scrivener, which was Adapt, Reject, Supplement. And I was trained to believe that this was what I should be doing with course books, that I couldn't just use the book, I had to adapt it, I had to reject some things, I had to supplement some things. And I think this idea continues to be quite a powerful idea to this day. Once I then started teaching, as I said, and started reading more about teaching, a lot of the things I read, I think, just basically consolidated these kinds of ideas for me. They didn't challenge or develop the way I was thinking about lesson planning. Probably like many of you, one of the very first books about language teaching I read was the Jeremy Harmer book, The Practice of English Language Teaching, although mine was the 3rd edition back in 1993, not the shiny new 5th edition here. And in this particular edition that I had, this was one of the things I was told about planning. Teachers who overuse a textbook, I mustn't be one of those, and thus repeatedly follow the sequence in each unit may become boring. They'll find themselves doing the same kind of activities in the same order over and again. One of the cornerstones of good planning is the use of variety. So again, this kind of made me feel mustn't be boring, mustn't do the same kinds of activities over again, must mix things up and keep things varied. Another quote from The Practice of English Language Teaching: each class has to be treated differently. This is particularly true when it comes to planning, where we select the activities that will be working for our students. And Jeremy then sort of talked about language and bringing language into the classroom. And again, there was this assumption that the language focus would essentially be grammatical. If new language is to be introduced, we'll list some or all of the models, grammar in other words, on any formal plan. We can often anticipate that the new language may cause problems because of its form. Grammar, again, the introduction of the past simple, for example, may cause particular problems. Excuse me, demonstrating my adherence to cliched English good morning behaviour. The next book that I read about teaching was by Jim Scrivener, and it was called Learning Teaching. And again, even in this book, there wasn't a huge amount of attention paid to or thought paid to what we do as teachers when we plan. So basically what we were told was, when you're planning a lesson, you have to ask yourself some questions. So you have to ask, will the learners enjoy doing the lesson? I hope so, because, you know, I need to keep them happy to keep my job. Will they benefit from it? I don't know. You know, let's hope they enjoy it first, and we'll worry about the benefits second. The aims, what will they achieve? I'm not really sure. What are you hoping to achieve? Survival. The teaching point, what's the subject of the lesson? What's the skill or language areas you'll be looking at? What activities will you use? What sequences will you come in? What text tapes? That shows you how old this book was at the time. Pictures, exercises will you use? What will you say? How will you arrange the seating? How much time will each stage take? 7 minutes, obviously. So many questions, and so difficult for me at the time to find the answers to these kinds of questions. I think what happened as a result of my training, as a result of my mentoring in my first language school, and as a result of the reading that I engaged in, is that essentially lesson planning came to mean thinking about a string of activities that I could tie together across 60 minutes or 90 minutes. I basically came to envisage my classes as a string of things to do. If you'd taken me to one side back then and asked me, what are you doing in class today? The way I would have answered that would have been to tell you, well, first we're going to do a warmer, then I'm going to do a grammar presentation, then I'm going to do a communicative activity, then I'm going to do a song which has 32 examples of the present perfect simple in it. And where I was supplementing quite heavily around topics. So I'd bring in extra vocabulary or extra speaking points connected to the topic of the unit, or the grammar points that we were looking at. And I think the questions that I was asking myself at the time were mostly these. How can I add more grammar practice to what's in the book? Can I add just more vocab around the topic? And is there a fun, chatty, communicative kind of game that I could squeeze in on top of all of this somewhere? And I think, even though I wasn't conscious of it at the time, there were some beliefs that were unconsciously underpinning what I was doing in the classroom. And these beliefs were, I realise now, looking back on things, that the accurate production of grammar is best mastered through further massed practice. So you do your big presentation, you do your big controlled practice and your free practice, and then you do more controlled practice and free practice. And I believed at that point that this would somehow result in accurate production. I guess I also believed that with vocabulary, it was mainly important to cover the meanings, and it was more important to do less with a lot than to do more with a little. It was more important to kind of skim over a lot of new items than it was to go deeper into the language that was already there. I believed that lessons had to be fun, in great big glowing, shiny, neon capital letters, fun, sparkling away. And I guess I believe that speaking, almost any kind of speaking, was an end in and of itself. And as a result, looking back, I did lots of very wacky kind of speaking activities, often designed to practice grammar. So I would have students do things like pizza versus Paris, where they would take random nouns out of a bag, and they would have 1 minute each to say why pizza was better than Paris and why Paris was better than pizzas. And every time they used a comparative correctly, they'd get 1 point. So the students would be saying things like, pizza is more delicious to eat than Paris. Yes, but Paris is more romantic than a pizza. And this would go on and on. And I would go home thinking, that's great. They used comparatives 312 times in that lesson. They must have it by now. Maybe my road to this particular point in my teaching career has some echoes in your own experience. I'll leave you to ponder the degree to which what I've been talking about sounds familiar to you. I guess what changed for me was slowly starting to rethink what a lesson should be. And one of the ways this changed was by me starting to write my own lessons more. Excuse me 1 minute. My apologies. And one of the things that influenced me to begin with when it came to thinking about what lessons should try to do was the Common European Framework. The Common European Framework suggests three main goals for language teaching. Language teaching should help our students to deal with the business of everyday life, to exchange thoughts, feelings, ideas and opinions with other young people around the world, and the idealistic notion that it should broaden their understanding of other cultures, other ways of being and other ways of life. And that makes sense to me. Those are the things that generally we use language to do in our daily lives. If you just take these three windows into what we do in the classroom, or three filters, if you like, I think these are good ways of analysing course books, analysing lessons, helping you to think about, well, what is my lesson today doing? Is it helping students deal with the business of everyday life? Is it helping them exchange thoughts, feelings, ideas and opinions? Is it broadening their understanding of different cultures? Or is it just a fairly strange controlled practice of the present perfect simple and the past simple? With the Pearson global scale of English, this expands on the Common European Framework, consolidates and expands on the Common European Framework, and it provides teachers and writers with real-world outcomes that we can help our students work towards at different levels. So as a writer with Roadmap, one of the things I was doing, is looking at the global scale of English, looking at what the desired outcomes were at particular levels, and thinking from there about how I can help students move towards a point where they're more able to achieve these real world outcomes. And just to give you some examples, the first book in the Roadmap series that I was involved in, along with my co-author Andrew Walkley, was the B1 plus level. And in the GSE, at B1 plus, sort of intermediate plus if you like, it says that students should learn how to express opinions and react to practical suggestions about where to go, what to do, etc. Make a complaint, okay? Speak in general terms about environmental problems. Discuss the main points of news stories about familiar topics to you as a student. Give a short rehearsed talk or presentation on a familiar topic. Make excuses using a range of polite forms. Teacher, I'm so sorry I didn't do my homework. I forgot. The dog ate my book. I did do my homework, but I left it on the bus, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these kinds of things. And obviously, this is just a small selection of some of the many outcomes that are suggested to help students achieve these kinds of goals. And so for me as a writer, I'm looking at these things thinking, okay, at this level, yes, it would be good if students were better at making complaints. It would be good if they could get better at discussing the main points of news stories or make excuses using a range of polite forms. How does that transfer itself into a lesson? How can I best help students towards this particular destination? When you're reading through the goals, in a sense, both in the Pearson GSE and in the Common European Framework, you notice some key ideas that start to emerge from these goals. One is, I think, a general shift in the way in which English language teaching is going, which is much more towards the primary focus being the communicative goal, what it is you're trying to help students get better at doing. And the grammar focus and the vocabulary focus that you bring into your lessons are obviously still important. They still need to be there, but they're secondary to helping students achieve a particular kind of communicative goal. There's often an emphasis on fixed phrases, on patterns, on routines, on learning predictable and typical ways of saying things, writing things, doing things. There's quite an emphasis on developing range, going deeper into what you can do already. So, okay, maybe you can have basic conversations about work, develop the range, go deeper into that conversation, expand it, get better at talking about it. Interestingly, there's quite a lot of emphasis on both general topics and the familiar. And I think as a younger teacher, maybe this resonates with some of you, I was often guilty of skipping through topics quite quickly and always looking for something new and exciting. I think this is why so many course books have exercises or units based around kind of zeitgeisty topics like extreme sports, because it looks kind of hot and sexy and new. Actually, a lot of the time the conversations fall fairly flat because the students will ask each other, do you do any extreme sports at all? No, I don't. They look a bit extreme. Yeah, I know what you mean. Me neither. Finish, teacher. And as a teacher, you're thinking, we've got 10 more pages to do on this particular topic. We're doomed. But actually, a lot of the time, what you do with a foreign language is talk about the familiar and talk about general topics. My best foreign language is Indonesian. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years and my wife's Indonesian. 50% of the conversations I ever have in Indonesian are about food. The Indonesians are very much like the Chinese or the Italians in this respect. And the conversations are familiar and they're about a general topic, but you can always get better at those particular conversations because there's always more to learn. So this leads us to this idea of back to the future. If you know the future that you want to take your students towards, this helps you go backwards and plan the route more directly. I first encountered this idea of backwards planning, not in English language teaching, actually. I was reading a book about American high school syllabus design, and it was talking about how eventually they looked at American high school syllabuses or syllabi, and they realized that there was often a problem in that the outcomes students were being tested on didn't match the input that they were being given. So the input was taking them in one direction and they were being tested on something else entirely. So for me, what backwards planning involves as a coursebook writer, as a teacher, is dramatic suspense. For those of you upset at the end of Game of Thrones, I think what it means is deciding what you want your students to be better able to do by the end of the lesson. That's the first thing you need to do. Then what it involves is imagining the conversations. Okay, if students are going to make a complaint at this level, who are they complaining to, when, why, what is it they're going to say? If they're making excuses for what, who to, why would they be doing this in English? What's the actual conversation? What does the student say? What does the other person say? So it means kind of imagining the actual conversations. Maybe then it means choosing or writing, scripting, realistic models that show students, look, here's a similar conversation to the one that I want you to have, to the one I'm teaching you to have. Once you've got your models, it means looking at those models and thinking about what's going on within the models linguistically, analysing them, mining them for language, both in terms of grammar and in terms of vocabulary, and maybe also just in terms of structure or patterns that obviously happen within some particular kinds of models. It means being concrete about the language, not just saying a lexical set about shop vocabulary or I don't know, different verbs for complaining, not just the past simple. It means thinking specifically about, well, what actual language do students need to be able to perform this task? And can I make a set of language that's on level, but that's also particularly useful for them when they're trying to achieve this communicative goal? Fine, they need to look at some examples of the past simple, but which examples in which contexts will best help them achieve the communicative goals we're aiming towards? It means noticing chunks, blocks of words which go together, noticing collocations. It also means thinking about the role of the listener, thinking about the things that the person they're talking to will say in response to what they're saying. Something Mike McCarthy has called listenership. And it means thinking about text structure. It then means writing exercises to teach some of this language that will help the students be better able to do what you want them to do, thinking about your aims, and building back up towards the final task. So the real idea is once you know your final destination, it's much easier to construct a road, to kind of map out the path that will take the students towards that particular place. So let's just look at what this might mean in practice for a little bit, okay? This is from one of the units that I co-wrote with Andrew from the B1 Plus book. It's Unit 8B. What we've done with Roadmap is each individual double-page spread has its own internal topic. The units themselves don't have topics like extreme sports or relationships. Different pages have different topics because that works much better when you're thinking about achieving the communicative goals. So the goal here, taken from the Pearson GSE, is help students talk about different relationships. Okay. Within that, we worked out the grammar from the syllabus that we thought worked best, which was ever's, whatever, whoever, whenever, however. And we do have a lexical set based around character. Okay. Our first thing that we're doing as writers is we're looking at this goal and we're thinking, okay, talk about different relationships. Who's talking, when, who to, why, what's the final task? And this is actually where we begin, in a way, by thinking about the lesson. We think about where we want students to end. And the final part is this. This is exercise 12 on the double page. Work in pairs. Give a list of your people to your partner. Take turns interviewing each other about people in your life. Use some of the questions below. You know, who's Rebecca? Do you get on okay? Oh no, how come? What happened? Do you see much of each other? Use whatever, wherever in your answers if you can. So we know that at the end of the lesson, we want students to talk about and ask each other about people that they know in their lives. So once we have this as the final destination, we can go back and we can map out the road that will take students to this particular place. So I'll just talk you through this briefly. What we always try to do is what I think all good teachers do, which is to start from the students and to use their ideas and use their experiences. So we have some pictures here. The students just discuss what relationships are shown in the photos. You know, there's a father-son, there's a personal trainer in a gym, there's maybe two best friends, there's a mentor and an employee, or an apprentice and a kind of master crafts person up at the top. Which of the relationships do you have? How important are they? Which is more important for you, family or friends? With these, there's no correct answers. They kind of get students into the area that you want them to be talking about. They then hear 4 conversations. They have to find out which relationships do they discuss. In conversation 4, they discuss 3 relationships. They choose which of these relationships they're hearing about. Again, these serve as kind of models of the conversations we want students to have later. We pull some language out. Who do these sentences describe? She's so cute. The new niece. She's the sensible one. Good job, married, calm, under pressure. Older sister. Yeah. So again, it's looking at some language. It's using the texts as a vehicle for getting some language. There's a little personal response again. How good are the relationships you heard about in exercise 2? So they have a model. Out of this, we then pull the grammar. So the grammar emerges from a context, which is also the context in which we later want students to practice it. There's a little kind of listen and complete. You can do it as a memory test if you want first, and then listen and complete. I can't control him. He does whatever he wants. It's a parent and difficult child. He always says hi whenever I see him. Neighbour, who one doesn't know very well. There's then a grammar box where students use the examples that they've heard or read in other contexts to help them work out the meanings of the grammar themselves. So we're kind of leading them towards the meaning, guiding them towards discovering the generalized rules about the grammar. There's some pronunciation. The pronunciation's integrated throughout. You know, listen to the sentences again, notice the stress. There's a controlled practice. Wherever you are in the world, you can always find people you get on with. Whoever you marry, the most most important thing is that you love them. You should try to stay together, whatever happens. Do you think it's good advice or not? So again, it's treating the grammar as things students might actually have opinions about. And then there's a practice, which is, make your own advice and share your advice. How much do you agree with each other? We then have some vocabulary, but again, it's thinking about high frequency vocabulary. It's thinking about vocabulary that's on level. It's also thinking about what students are going to do with this vocabulary when they're talking about people they know. So it's things like, he can be quite difficult. He just seems to oppose everything I suggest and think of problems. She's a really talented singer. She should try and do it professionally, but she says she's not good enough. She lacks a bit of confidence. What kind of relationships do you think are being discussed? So it recycles this idea of different relationships. And then there's some questions about the language. How might kids be nasty to each other? Why might someone lack confidence? What might you do if you're politically active? What can you do to stay calm? Leave the classroom, count, breathe, count to 10, go back in. And then finally, we have the speaking, but we stagger the speaking. We scaffold it, we build up to it to help students. So what we always do is we do a preparation stage where the students hear other people doing almost an exact sort of replica of the task we're then going to ask the students to do. So they're going to talk about people you know. You hear two people doing the same. Who are they talking about? What are they like? This also gives us as writers the chance to subtly, subliminally recycle some of the vocabulary and some of the grammar that we've just exposed students to. They write a list of 6 people they've got a relationship with. They can use the relationships in this lesson, can be good or bad relationships. Think about what are they like, how well do you get on with them, can you give examples of their behavior and of their character? And then they do this pair work where they swap over. And I think from a student's point of view, there's a clarity of purpose. You're much more able to see the thread that links everything that's been going on in the lesson. As a teacher, you know that you can sell this to the students by saying, okay, so you've heard some listenings about different kinds of relationships. We've looked at this grammar for describing different kinds of behaviors. We've looked at the vocabulary for describing what people are like and given some examples of that behavior. Now, let's try and have similar conversations ourselves. And so you're much more able as a teacher to show students, here's how the input that's preceded this helps you to achieve these particular goals or these particular outcomes. This is a quick picture of the roadmap series. It's a new 8-level series, not all levels out yet, but it will be an 8-level series, rather groundbreaking in itself, particularly designed to help students get through that very difficult intermediate hump or plateau.